The blood on her scrubs had dried into a stiff, dark armor long before the sun went down. She hadn't eaten in a day. She hadn't sat down since the first medevac touched the tarmac. But when the dust finally settled, after 18 hours of hell on Earth, the nightmare wasn't over for Lieutenant Everly Parker. The tent flap flew open, and Colonel Mercer, the man known as the Butcher of Helmand, strode in. He wasn't there to check on the wounded. He was looking for her. The room went deathly silent. Everyone thought Everly was about to be court-martialed for the decision she made in hour 12. Instead, what happened next would bring the entire base to tears and change military protocol forever. This is the true story of the longest shift in history. The digital clock on the wall of the trauma bay flickered. Reading 0542. It was a lie. Time didn't exist inside the canvas walls of the Forward Surgical Team FST unit. Nestled deep in a valley that the maps didn't bother to name, there was only before the choppers and after the choppers. Lieutenant Everly Parker adjusted her glasses with the back of her wrist, smearing a streak of sweat across her forehead. She was 32, but under the harsh fluorescent lights, buzzing like angry hornets. She looked 50. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it hurt, secured under a surgical cap that had seen cleaner days. Status on Bay 2. Everly barked, her voice raspy. "Stabilized," replied Dr. Arthur Banks, a surgeon whose hands were steadier than his nerves. "But we're running low on O negative. If another bird comes in, we're going to have to start draining the donors." "We don't have donors, Arthur. We have exhausted grunts." Everly shot back, checking the vitals of a young corporal sleeping off anesthesia in the corner. The convoy that just left took half the walking blood bank with them. The valley was supposed to be quiet. Intelligence had promised a lull in the fighting, a chance for the medical staff to restock and maybe catch 4 hours of sleep. Intelligence was wrong. At 6 o'clock, the radio in the corner crackled. It was the sound every medic dreaded, the frantic, high-pitched scream of a pilot trying to be heard over incoming fire. "Inbound. Heavy. Mass call. Repeat. Mass cal. ETA 4 mics." The static swallowed the rest, but Everly heard enough. Mass cal. Mass casualty. "All hands." Everly yelled, the exhaustion instantly replaced by a surge of adrenaline that felt like ice water in her veins. "Wake them up, get Jenkins. Get O'Malley. I want trauma shears on every table. Prep the rapid infusers." The tent, previously a scene of quiet fatigue, erupted. Nurses and medics scrambled from their cots, boots unlaced, eyes wide. They knew the drill. They just didn't know that this wasn't an ordinary mass cal. This was the beginning of the longest night. The roar of the rotors hit them before the helicopters landed. It was a physical weight, shaking the dust from the tent poles. The flaps blew open, bringing in the smell of burning diesel and copper. The first stretcher came in, then the second, then a third. "Where do you want him?" "Parker." A flight medic screamed, his face covered in soot. "Bay 1. Everly pointed. "What's the injury?" "IED blast. Traumatic amputation. Right leg. Tourniquet applied at 0550. He's hypertensive." Everly didn't hesitate. She moved to the soldier, a man whose face was caked in mud, his eyes rolling back in his head. She checked the tourniquet. It was loose. "Banks, I need you here," she shouted, tightening the strap until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. She grabbed an IV line, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 similar movements. "Hang 2 units. Push 100 of fentanyl." The soldier gripped her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong for a dying man. He looked at her, his blue eyes piercing through the grime. My brother!" he wheezed. "We've got you, soldier," Everly said, her voice dropping to that soothing, maternal tone she reserved for the bedside. "You're safe." "No." He coughed, pink froth bubbling at his lips. "My brother. He's in the second bird. Don't. Let him die." Everly looked up as the second Black Hawk touched down. The noise was deafening. The influx wasn't stopping. It was a convoy ambush, a big one, for the next 4 hours. Everly didn't think. She became a machine. She cut away uniforms, packed wounds with combat gauze, started IVs, and held the hands of men who were crying out for their mothers. She triaged with ruthless efficiency. Black tag for the ones who wouldn't make it. Red tag for the ones who might die in the next 10 minutes. Yellow for the ones who could wait. She hated the black tags. She hated playing God. By 10 o'clock a.m., the floor was slick. Her boots squelched as she walked. She had treated 12 patients personally and overseen 20 others. Her back screamed in protest, a dull ache radiating down her spine, but she ignored it. "Parker!" "Doctor." Banks called out from behind a sterile curtain. "We have a problem." Everly stepped over a pile of discarded bloody bandages. "What is it?" "We're out of whole blood," Banks said, his mask hiding his expression, but his eyes showing pure terror. "And we have 3 red tags incoming from the perimeter defense. They're bringing them in by truck." Everly looked at the cooler. Empty. The supply drop hadn't arrived. "Get the walking blood bank protocol online," she ordered. "Test the staff. Test the cooks. Test anyone with a pulse." "It takes too long." "Evie," Banks whispered, using her first name, a sign of his desperation. "These guys are bleeding out now." Everly looked at the soldier on the table, the one who had asked about his brother. He was stable, but fragile. Then she looked at the door where the truck was pulling up. She made a decision that wasn't in the manual, a decision that could cost her her career, or worse, her freedom. "Get me a transfusion kit," Everly said, rolling up her own sleeve. "Evie, you're O positive," Banks warned. "You're barely 120 pounds. You can't give while you're working. You'll pass out." "I said get me a kit," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "Hook me up to him. Direct line. I'm not losing this kid." Banks hesitated, then nodded. He inserted the needle into her vein. Everly watched her own dark red life force flow through the tube, directly into the arm of the dying boy on the table. She worked one-handed for the next hour, dizzy, her vision tunneling, keeping herself upright by sheer force of will. She was literally pouring herself into the job. But the 18 hours were just beginning, and the colonel was watching from afar. By hour 9, 1400 hours, the adrenaline had curdled into a thick, toxic fatigue. The direct transfusion had saved the young soldier, Private Leo Higgins. But it had drained Everly. Her skin was the color of old parchment. Every time she stood up too fast, black spots danced in her vision. The mass cal had officially ended, meaning the helicopters had stopped landing in waves. Now, it was the slow trickle. This was almost worse. It was the sniper victims, the stragglers, the civilians caught in the crossfire. Everly detached the line from her arm, taping a piece of gauze over the puncture wound. She grabbed a juice box from the supply crate warm, sugary orange liquid that tasted like heaven, and downed it in one gulp. "Lieutenant!" a voice boomed from the entrance. Everly stiffened. It was Master Sergeant Cole. He was a mountain of a man, the NCO in charge of the base security. He wasn't medical, which meant if he was in the surgical tent, something was wrong with the war, not the patients. "Sergeant," Everly nodded, leaning against a counter to hide the trembling in her legs. "We've got a situation at the North Gate," Cole said, his face grim. "Locals brought in a truck, civilian casualties, but intelligence says there's a high-value target mixed in, a warlord's son. They think he's wounded. I treat patients, Sergeant. I don't care who their father is," Everly said, grabbing a fresh pair of gloves. "The colonel wants him secured. If he comes in, he gets priority. We need him alive for intel," Cole stated, crossing his arms. Colonel Mercer was specific. If the warlord's son dies, we lose the valley. Colonel Jack Mercer. Everly had never met him face to face, but his reputation hung over the base like a storm cloud. He was a tactician, a cold calculator of risks and assets. To him, this hospital wasn't a place of healing. It was a repair shop for military hardware. "If he comes in, I'll triage him like everyone else," Everly said firmly. "That's not the order, Lieutenant," Cole warned. Just then, the double doors banged open. Soldiers rushed in, carrying 2 stretchers. On the first stretcher lay a man in his 30s, bearded, wearing local garb. He was screaming in a language Everly didn't speak, clutching a shattered shoulder. He looked well-fed, healthy. On the second stretcher was a woman. She was tiny, frail, wearing a dust-covered hijab. Her abdomen was soaked in blood. She was silent. Too silent. "That's him," Cole pointed to the bearded man. "Secure him. Get the doctor." "Doctor?" Banks rushed to the man. "He's got a shattered clavicle. Painful, but not life-threatening." Everly moved to the woman. She cut away the fabric. A piece of shrapnel had torn through her lower abdomen. Her pulse was thready, almost non-existent. She was bleeding internally. "Banks!" Everly called out. "I need you. She's crashing. Ruptured spleen. Maybe liver involvement. I'm stabilizing the asset," Banks yelled back, looking nervously at Sergeant Cole, who was hovering over him. "The Colonel's orders." "The Colonel isn't a doctor," Everly screamed, her voice cracking. "This man is stable. This woman has 2 minutes to live." "Lieutenant Parker, stand down!" Sergeant Cole barked, stepping between Everly and Dr. Banks. "Doctor, Banks is to treat the high-value target. That is a direct order from command." Everly looked at the woman. Her eyes were open, brown pools of terrified resignation. She was gripping Everly's scrub top with a weak, desperate hand. Everly looked at the asset. He was yelling at the soldiers, angry but very much alive. His vitals were strong. It was the impossible choice. Follow orders and let an innocent woman die, or defy the chain of command and save a life. In the military, disobeying a direct order in a combat zone could mean prison. It could mean dishonorable discharge. Everly closed her eyes for a split second. She saw her own mother's face. She opened her eyes. They were hard as flint. "Move, Sergeant," Everly said, her voice dangerously low. "Excuse me." Cole blinked, surprised by the ferocity coming from the small, exhausted woman. "I said move." Everly shoved the giant man aside. She didn't have the strength to fight him, but she had the element of surprise. She grabbed the ultrasound machine and wheeled it to the woman's bedside. "Banks, if you don't scrub in on this laparotomy right now, I will report you to the medical board for negligence. He is stable. She is dying. Do your job." The tent went silent. The medics froze. Even the wounded soldiers watched. Everleigh Parker had just effectively mutinied against the base commander's orders in front of his lead NCO. Banks looked at the asset, then at the woman. The Hippocratic oath warred with his fear of Colonel Mercer. "Prep the tray," Banks said quietly, turning away from the bearded man. "Cole, get that guy some morphine and shut him up. I'm operating on the woman." Sergeant Cole's face turned purple. He reached for his radio. "Base, this is Cole. We have a situation in the FST. Protocol violation. Advise the colonel." Everleigh didn't hear him. She was already intubating the woman. She had saved the patient. But she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that she had just signed her own warrant. The surgery took 3 hours. They saved the woman's spleen. She would live. By the time they closed the incision, it was hour 12, 1700. The sun was dipping below the valley walls. Everleigh stripped off her bloody gown and walked to the sink. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the soap bar. She dropped it. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the sink and let out a sob she had been holding back since morning. "Lieutenant," a medic whispered, tapping her shoulder. You should see outside." Everleigh wiped her face and walked to the tent flap. A Humvee had pulled up. Not an ambulance, a command vehicle. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He wore a beret and a uniform that was impeccably pressed despite the dust. He had silver eagles on his collar. It was Colonel Mercer. He didn't look angry. He looked unreadable. He walked straight toward the medical tent, his boots crunching on the gravel with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Everleigh's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of her career. But the night wasn't done with her yet, and neither was the war. As the colonel reached the door, the ground suddenly lurched. A massive explosion ripped through the air, less than 100 yards away. The lights in the tent flickered and died. "Incoming!" Someone screamed. The base was under attack, and Everleigh Parker was trapped in the dark with the man who had come to destroy her. The world didn't go black. It went grey. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized concrete and dust swept through the surgical tent, instantly coating every surface. The emergency generators kicked in with a guttural cough, bathing the chaotic scene in a dim, blood-red wash of light. "Masks up!" Everleigh screamed, pulling the collar of her scrub top over her nose. "Protect the open abdomens!" The blast had knocked Doctor Banks into a supply cart. Instruments, scalpels, clamps, retractors were scattered across the floor like metal confetti. But Everleigh didn't look at the mess. Her eyes locked on the monitors. They were dead. The surge had fried the secondary circuits. "Ventilators are down!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the ringing in everyone's ears. "We have 4 patients on vents. Grab the ambu bags, move." It was chaos, but it was a controlled chaos. The medics, trained in the rhythm of disaster, scrambled. They grabbed the manual resuscitator's plastic football-shaped bags and attached them to the breathing tubes of the unconscious soldiers. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. They became the lungs for the men who couldn't breathe. Everleigh was sprinting toward the civilian woman, the one she had just operated on, when a strong hand grabbed her upper arm. It wasn't a gentle grip. It was iron. She spun around, ready to fight, and found herself chest to chest with Colonel Jack Mercer, up close. The Butcher of Hellmand was terrifying. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow, and his eyes were the color of cold steel. He wasn't panicked. He was assessing. He looked at the chaos, then he looked at Everleigh. "Report, Lieutenant," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that made the hair on Everly's arms stand up. Power surge took the vents. Everly gasped, trying to wrench her arm free. "We're manual bagging. We have multiple critical patients, and you are in my sterile field. Colonel!" Mercer didn't let go. "The perimeter is breached. We have hostiles inside the wire. This tent is a soft target. I need to know which of these men can hold a weapon." Everly stared at him in disbelief. "None of them. They are sedated, in shock, or missing limbs. This is a hospital, not an armory. This is a war zone. Parker," Mercer snapped. "If the insurgents get in here, they will kill everyone, including your civilians." He released her, drawing a sidearm from his hip holster with a fluid, practiced motion. He moved toward the entrance, kicking over a tray of sterile gauze to create a barricade. "Banks!" Everly shouted, ignoring the colonel. "Check the asset. I've got the woman." Everly reached the woman's bedside. The monitor was dark, so Everly pressed 2 fingers to the woman's carotid artery. The pulse was there, thready, fast, but there. The woman's eyes fluttered open in the red emergency light. She looked like a ghost. "You," the woman whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the distant rattle of automatic gunfire. "Don't talk," Everly soothed, checking the fresh bandages on the woman's stomach. "Save your strength." The woman tried to point toward the other stretcher, where the bearded man, the asset, was thrashing against his restraints. "Traitor!" Everly frowned. What before the woman could answer, the tent flap shredded, not from the wind, but from a burst of AK-47 fire. Bullets zipped through the canvas, tearing through IV bags and shattering the few remaining light bulbs. A medic near the door, Private Miller, cried out and grabbed his thigh, crumpling to the floor. "Get down!" Colonel Mercer roared. He dropped to a knee behind the overturned supply desk and returned fire. Pop, pop, pop. 3 controlled shots into the darkness outside. Everly didn't hit the deck. She couldn't. If she dropped to the floor, she couldn't reach the manual bag for the woman. If she stopped squeezing the bag, the woman would suffocate. So, while bullets buzzed like angry bees through the tent, Lieutenant Everly Parker stood her ground. She hunched over the patient, using her own small body as a human shield, squeezing the bag. 1,000, 1,000. Mercer looked back between shots. He saw the medics cowering under the tables. He saw Dr. Banks trembling behind a metal cabinet. And he saw Everly Parker, exposed, calm, rhythmically squeezing a plastic bag to keep a dying stranger alive while lead flew past her head. For the first time in his career, Colonel Jack Mercer hesitated. He wasn't looking at a subordinate. He was looking at something he hadn't seen in a long time. Pure, unadulterated valor. "Cover her," Mercer bellowed to his security detail. Sergeant Cole, who had just crawled in through the back. Suppressing fire on the north quadrant, protect the nurse. Hour 14, 1900. The firefight outside had intensified. The FST was no longer just a hospital. It was the front line. The insurgents weren't just spraying and praying. They were coordinating an assault on the medical facility. They wanted something inside. Inside the tent. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, blood, and fear. The temperature had spiked. With the AC down, the tent was a sauna. Everly's arms were burning. Squeezing an ambu bag requires grip, strength, and rhythm. Doing it for 2 hours without a break is torture. Her forearms cramped. Her fingers went numb. But she didn't stop. "Banks!" Everly croaked, her throat dry as dust. "Switch with me." I can't." Banks stammered from the floor. He was curled in a fetal position, clutching his head. The surgeon had cracked. The stress of the surgery, followed by the immediate threat of death, had broken him. "Damn it! Arthur!" Everly hissed. She looked around. The medics were busy with the other critical patients, or treating Private Miller's leg wound. There was no one left, except one man. Colonel Mercer was reloading his weapon, his back pressed against a crate of saline. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Everly. He saw her grimace. He saw the tremor in her hands. He holstered his weapon and crawled over to her, keeping low. "Show me," Mercer said. Everly blinked, sweat dripping into her eyes. "What? Show me what to do," Mercer commanded. He knelt beside her. "You're losing your grip strength. If you cramp up, she dies. Show me." Everly didn't argue. "Grab the bag, seal the mask over her nose and mouth. Make a C shape with your thumb and index finger to hold it down. Squeeze the bag with your other hand, not too hard, just enough to see the chest rise, once every 6 seconds. Mercer's large, rough hands that had strangled men and signed death warrants, took the delicate plastic mask. He adjusted his grip. He squeezed. The woman's chest rose. "Like that?" he asked, his voice surprisingly quiet. "Yes," Everly breathed, shaking out her numb hands. She grabbed a stethoscope and checked the woman's lungs. "Good air movement. Keep going." For the next 20 minutes, the surreal tableau held the Butcher of Helmond on his knees in the dirt, manually ventilating an unknown civilian woman, while his troops fought a war 10 feet away. "Why her?" Mercer asked, his eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the chest. Watt Everly was checking the IV lines, trying to salvage what remained of the fluids. "You disobeyed a direct order," Mercer said. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded curious. "Sergeant Cole told me. You chose to operate on her instead of the asset. Why?" Everly looked at the asset. The bearded man. He was awake now, staring at the ceiling, looking strangely calm for a man in a war zone. "Triage isn't about rank, Colonel," Everly said, wiping blood from a monitor screen with her sleeve. "It's about need. He was stable. She was dying. In this tent, biology outranks ideology," Mercer grunted. "Ideology wins wars. Lieutenant, biology just rots." "Biology is all we have," Everly countered. "When you strip away the uniforms and the flags, we're all just sacks of blood and bone trying not to leak. My job is to stop the leaking. Your job is to... well, I guess your job is to make them leak." Mercer looked at her sharply. Most officers would have court-martialed her for that comment. But Mercer just squeezed the bag. "Whoosh. You have a smart mouth. Parker. I have a tired mouth. Colonel, I've been on my feet for 14 hours. Suddenly, the asset began to shout. He wasn't shouting in pain. He was shouting in Pashto. He was shouting toward the tent flap, toward the enemy gunfire. "What is he saying?" Everly asked. Mercer's face went rigid. He understood the language. "He's giving them coordinates. He's telling them we're in here. He's telling them to bring the RPGs." Mercer dropped the ambu bag. "Don't stop," Everly screamed, diving for the mask as the woman's oxygen levels began to drop instantly. Mercer stood up, drawing his weapon. He walked over to the bearded man. The man smiled, a cold, triumphant smile. "He's not the target," Mercer realized, his voice turning to ice. "The intel was wrong. They aren't trying to rescue him. He's the beacon." Mercer grabbed the man by the collar. "Who are they coming for?" The man spat in Mercer's face. Before Mercer could react, A massive impact shook the ground. An RPG had hit the supply truck parked just outside the tent. The explosion tore the canvas roof completely open. The night sky, lit by tracer fire, was suddenly visible. Debris rained down. A heavy metal pole from the tent structure snapped and swung down like a scythe. "Look out!" Mercer shouted. He dove, not away from the danger, but toward Everly. He slammed into her, knocking her flat as the metal pole smashed into the ground exactly where she had been standing a second before. They tumbled into the dirt, tangled in IV lines. Mercer groaned, a sharp sound of pain escaping his lips. Everly pushed herself up, coughing in the dust. "Colonel!" Mercer rolled over. A shard of shrapnel from the explosion was embedded in his shoulder, soaking his uniform in dark blood. "I'm fine," he gritted out, trying to stand. He failed. "You're not fine," Everly said, her nurse's instinct overriding her fear. She put a hand on his chest to keep him down. "You're hit. The bag." Mercer gasped, pointing to the woman. "The woman." Everly looked. The woman was gasping, her body arching. She wasn't getting air. "I can't treat you and bag her at the same time," Everly cried. She looked at Dr. Banks, who was still useless in the corner. She looked at the medics, who were pinned down, returning fire. She had to make a choice again. Treat the colonel, the highest-ranking officer in the sector, or save the civilian woman who caused all this trouble. Mercer saw the hesitation in her eyes. He grabbed her wrist with his good hand. "Save her," he ordered. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Save her." Everly nodded. She scrambled back to the woman and resumed bagging. "Banks!" She screamed, channeling every ounce of rage and exhaustion into her voice. "Get your ass over here and put pressure on the colonel's wound, or I will kill you myself. Dr. Banks," shamed by the terror in her voice, or perhaps the threat, finally moved. He crawled over to Mercer and pressed a trauma pad onto the shoulder wound. The battle for the FST raged on. Hour 15, hour 16, 2100. The gunfire had stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The Apache gunships had arrived. The distinct thwop, thwop, thwop of the attack helicopters had sent the insurgents scattering back into the mountains. The silence that followed was heavy. The FST tent was a ruin. The roof was gone. The equipment was destroyed, and the floor was a mud pit of blood and dust. But the patients were alive. Everly sat on an overturned bucket, her head in her hands. She was trembling uncontrollably now, the adrenaline crash. She had been working for 16 hours. She was dehydrated, starving, and emotionally hollowed out. The backup generators had finally been repaired. A single halogen work light flickered on, casting long, harsh shadows across the devastation. Colonel Mercer sat on a cot nearby. His shoulder was bandaged, his arm in a sling. He was pale, but he was sitting upright. He was watching Everly. "Lieutenant," he said. Everly didn't look up. "If you're going to arrest me." "Colonel, can we do it tomorrow? I think I'm going to throw up." "I'm not going to arrest you," Mercer said. He stood up, unsteady, and walked over to the civilian woman's bed. The woman was awake. She was breathing on her own now, the anesthesia wearing off. She looked at Mercer, then at Everly. "Thank you," the woman said. Her English was accented but perfect. Everly raised her head. "You speak English?" "I was a translator," the woman whispered, "for the British, before the darkness came." Mercer stepped closer. "Who is he?" He pointed to the bearded man, who was now bound, gagged, and guarded by two very angry Marines. "He is my husband, the woman said, tears leaking from her eyes. And he is a monster. She took a shaky breath. He is not the warlord's son. He is the warlord's courier. He carries the money. She looked at Mercer. I stole the ledger, the book with all the names, all the safe houses. I sewed it into the lining of my vest. Mercer's eyes widened. The intel? It wasn't a person. It was a ledger. Yes, she nodded. I tried to run. He shot me. He brought me here because he thought I would die, and he could take the vest back without suspicion. He played the victim. She looked at Everly. He told the soldiers to let me die. He told them to save him. But you did not listen. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The asset the man Mercer had ordered to be prioritized was the enemy courier. The civilian casualty, the woman Everly had defied orders to save, was the true intelligence goldmine. She was carrying the key to dismantling the entire insurgent network in the valley. If Everly had followed orders, the woman would have died. The ledger would have been lost or recovered by the husband. The network would have remained intact. Everly's disobedience hadn't just saved a life. It had potentially won the campaign. Mercer looked at the woman. Then he turned slowly to look at Everly. He stared at her for a long time. The butcher was known for being ruthless, but he was also known for being fair. He saw the logic of the battlefield shift before his eyes. You knew, Mercer said to Everly. I didn't know anything, Everly said, standing up. Her legs wobbled. I just knew she was bleeding more than he was. That's it. That's all I knew. Mercer shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. You're a terrible liar, Parker, but you're a hell of a nurse. Is that a compliment? Sir, it's a fact. Mercer looked at his watch. 1,600 hours plus. You've been on shift for 16 hours. Something like that, Everly mumbled. Go to sleep, Lieutenant. That's an order. I can't, Everly said, gesturing to the other patients. Night shift doesn't come on for another 2 hours, if they can even get through the blockade. I have to change the dressings on Corporal Jones. I have to monitor the woman's hemoglobin. Parker, Mercer warned. No, sir, Everly said, finding a reserve of strength somewhere in the bottom of her soul. I don't leave my patients until I am relieved. That is the rule. Mercer looked at her. He saw the blood on her scrubs, some of it hers, some of it his, some of it the enemy's. He saw the dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. He realized then that he couldn't order her to stop. She was fueled by something he couldn't command. Fine, Mercer said. He turned to Sergeant Cole. Get me a fresh uniform, and get me a radio. Sir, Cole asked. You need to be medevaced. That shoulder needs surgery. My shoulder is fine, Mercer lied. Get me the radio. I need to call the general. I need to tell him that Lieutenant Parker just saved his ass. Everly didn't hear him. She was already walking back to the supply cart, limping slightly. She picked up a fresh roll of gauze. Hour 17 approached. The longest night was almost over, but the sun hadn't risen yet. And the final twist was yet to come. Hour 17. 2300. The silence in the forward surgical team tent was heavier than the gunfire had been. The adrenaline, that magical, golden elixir that had kept Lieutenant Everly Parker moving for 17 hours, had finally evaporated. In its place was a leaden, crushing weight. Her bones felt like they were made of granite. Her eyelids felt like sandpaper. The backup generator hummed a low, monotonous drone, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her teeth. The air was still thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt plastic from the earlier explosion. Everly moved through the tent like a ghost. She was checking the urine output of the burn victim in Bay 3. It was a simple task: read the measurement on the bag, write it on the chart. But her brain was misfiring. She looked at the numbers, and for a terrifying second, they danced and rearranged themselves. She blinked hard, forcing her eyes to focus. 30 cubic centimeters. Borderline. She wrote it down, her handwriting a jagged scrawl that she barely recognized as her own. "Lieutenant!" A voice rasped from the corner. It was Colonel Mercer. He hadn't left. Despite his shattered shoulder, despite the morphine doctor, Banks had finally convinced him to take. He had refused the medevac flight that had come for the other critical patients. He sat in a folding chair near the entrance, his good hand resting on his sidearm, watching the door, watching her. "Sir," Everly's voice was a whisper. Her throat was so dry it clicked when she swallowed. "You're weaving," Mercer said. He wasn't criticizing. He was observing. "Sit down. Parker, that's an order." "Can't," Everly mumbled, shuffling toward the next bed. "Private Higgins needs his dressing changed. If I sit, I won't get up." She reached the bed of Private Leo Higgins, the young soldier from the very first hour, the one who had begged her to save his brother. He was awake, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. He had lost his leg, but he was alive. "Lieutenant," Leo whispered. "I'm here." "Leo," Everly said, peeling back the tape on his stump. Her fingers were numb, her fine motor skills gone. She fumbled with the gauze, dropping a piece. She stared at it on the dirty floor, tears of frustration suddenly pricking her eyes. "Pick it up," she told herself. "Just bend down and pick it up." But she knew if she bent down, she would fall. "Leave it," Leo said softly. He reached out and touched her hand. His skin was hot, feverish. "You saved him." Everly looked at him, confused. "Who?" "My brother." Leo smiled weakly. "The guy in the next bed. The medic told me. You gave him your own blood. You saved him." Everly looked at the soldier in the next cot. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. She had forgotten. In the blur of the last 17 hours, the individual acts of heroism had blended into a single, grey nightmare. Everly started, but her knees finally buckled. She didn't hit the floor. Colonel Mercer was there. He had moved across the room with a speed that belied his injury, catching her by the elbow with his good arm. He guided her to an empty supply crate and sat her down. "Breathe," Mercer commanded. He grabbed a bottle of water from a nearby tray, cracked the seal with his teeth, and handed it to her. "Drink." Everly drank. The water was warm and tasted like plastic, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drained the bottle in 3 gulps. "What time is it?" she asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. 23:45, Mercer said, checking his watch. 15 minutes to shift change. 15 minutes to the 18-hour mark. "I have to report." Everly tried to stand. "The relief team. They won't know the protocols. They won't know about the woman's allergy to penicillin. They won't know that Miller needs his pain meds every 3 hours, not 4. "You will give the report from right here," Mercer said, putting a heavy hand on her shoulder to keep her seated. "You have done enough, Lieutenant. You have done more than enough." Everly looked at him. For the first time, she really looked at him. The butcher of Helmond looked mortal. His face was grey with pain, his uniform soaked in blood at the shoulder. but his eyes were clear, and in them she saw something that terrified her more than the bullet's respect. "Why are you still here?" "Colonel," she asked. "You should be in a hospital in Germany by now." Mercer looked at the door. "I lost 3 men today. Parker. 3 good men. I'm not leaving until I know the people who saved the rest of us are still standing. I don't leave my rear guard behind." Everly nodded slowly. "We're not rear guard, sir. We're just nurses." Mercer laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Just nurses. Right. And I'm just a guy with a gun. You held this tent with a pair of scissors and a plastic bag. Parker, don't ever let anyone tell you you're just anything." The sound of heavy rotors began to thump in the distance, low, rhythmic, getting louder. "Relief," Mercer said, standing up and straightening his bloody uniform. "Showtime?" Hour 18. 0000. The transition wasn't subtle. It arrived with the concussive force of a sledgehammer. The sound of the inbound Chinook helicopter didn't just vibrate the ground. It rattled the very teeth in Everley's skull. For 17 hours, the tent had been a closed ecosystem of recycled air, copper-scented blood, and the sour reek of fear. But as the heavy canvas flaps were thrown back by the ground crew, the outside world came rushing in. The night air was shockingly cold, carrying the distinct, chemically sweet scent of aviation fuel and the dust of the high desert. It swirled through the trauma bay, kicking up the grit on the floor and fluttering the edges of the blood-soaked sterile drapes. Everly sat on an overturned supply crate, her body listing to the side like a sinking ship. She watched the entrance, her eyes burning and gritty, as if they were filled with sand. She tried to blink the blurriness away, but her focus was gone. The adrenaline that had served as her fuel, her armor, and her spine for the last day had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. Then, the boots hit the ground. A team of 6 medical personnel marched in. They were the night shift relief from the main operating base, deployed to salvage what was left of the forward surgical team. To Everley, they looked like aliens. Their scrubs were an impossible, vibrant blue, crisp and unwrinkled. Their boots were polished black, free of the grey dust that coated everything in the valley. Their faces were clean, shaven, and terrifyingly awake. Leading them was a man who walked with the stiff, clipped gait of an officer who lived by the manual. Major Sullivan. He stopped 3 feet inside the tent, his eyes scanning the room behind clear, smudge-free glasses. He didn't see the heroism. He didn't see the miracle of survival. He saw a disaster. The tent was a ruin. The floor was a slick, dark mosaic of bodily fluids and muddy boot prints. IV poles were bent at odd angles. Empty saline bags littered the corners like discarded husks. And the staff doctor, Banks, the medics Jenkins and O'Malley, and Everly herself looked less like medical professionals and more like the victims they had been treating. "Good God," Major Sullivan whispered, the words cutting through the sudden silence of the room. His nose wrinkled, a reflexive reaction to the stench of the slaughterhouse. He stepped further in, his boots making a sticky sound on the floor. He looked at Dr. Banks, who was slumped against a ventilator, staring at his own hands. Then he looked at Everly. He didn't recognize her rank. He barely recognized her as human. She was covered in layers of dried fluids, some dark and flaking, some fresh and bright. Her hair had escaped her cap, matted to her forehead with sweat and grime. "Report!" Sullivan barked. The volume was unnecessary. The tent was deadly quiet. He was trying to assert dominance over the chaos, to organize the unorganizable. Who is the OIC here? I want a status report, and I want it now. Everly forced her brain to engage. Officer in charge. That's me. The thought took seconds to process. She grabbed the edge of a metal table, her knuckles white as she hauled herself upright. Her legs shook so violently that the instruments on the table rattled. She tried to stand at attention, to square her shoulders, but her body refused to cooperate. She swayed. A reed in a gale. "Lieutenant Parker, reporting," she rasped. Her voice was a broken thing, a collection of friction and exhaustion. She cleared her throat, tasting bile. We have 7 critical, 3 stable, 2 pending transport. The burn victim in Bay 3 needs debridement. Major Sullivan looked her up and down, his expression hardening into cold disapproval. He was a man who believed that discipline was the foundation of medicine. If you couldn't keep your uniform clean, how could you keep a wound sterile? "Lieutenant, look at yourself," Sullivan snapped, gesturing vaguely at her ruined scrubs. "You are out of uniform, you are out of regulation, and look at this facility. Where are the sterile fields? Why is there trash in the trauma bay?" He walked over to the main desk, picking up a patient chart with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. "This chart is illegible." He threw it back down. "Who authorized a direct transfusion on patient 4? That is a violation of regulation 404. We have protocols for a reason. Lieutenant, you don't just improvise with human lives." He turned, his eyes landing on the civilian woman, Farah, who was sleeping in the priority bed, the bed reserved for the highest ranking or most critical casualty. "And why is there a local national in the Alpha bed?" Sullivan demanded, his voice rising. "That bed is for tactical assets. Who is responsible for this absolute failure of command?" The air in the tent froze. The day shift medics bristled. "Doctor." Banks looked up, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous anger. They had bled for this ground. They had held the line while mortars rained down. And now, this man with his clean clipboard was dissecting their trauma. Everly opened her mouth to apologize. That was the instinct. Apologize for the mess. Apologize for the blood. Apologize for surviving. But she had no air left in her lungs. She just lowered her head, the shame burning hot in her chest. I apologize, Major," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We did our best." "Your best," Sullivan scoffed, shaking his head. "If this is your best, Lieutenant, then you have no business wearing that rank. You have let standards collapse. This is negligence. I am responsible." The voice didn't come from the medical staff. It came from the shadows near the rear entrance, deep and resonant, like rocks grinding together. Major Sullivan spun around. Colonel Jack Mercer stepped into the harsh circle of light cast by the halogen work lamp. He looked like a spectre of war. His left arm was bound tight against his chest in a blood-soaked sling. His uniform was torn, revealing the hasty bandages underneath. His face was a mask of grey dust, sweat, and dried blood. But the silver eagles on his collar caught the light, and the look in his eyes was terrifying. Sullivan's arrogance evaporated instantly. His eyes went wide, and his spine snapped straight. His heels clicked together with a sharp crack. "Colonel Mercer, sir," Sullivan stammered, his face draining of color. I didn't see you there. Sir, I wasn't informed you were on site." "At ease." "Major." Mercer growled. He didn't stop walking until he was in the center of the room, dominating the space. He didn't look at Sullivan. He looked at Everly. He watched her swaying by the table, holding herself up by sheer willpower. "You asked who is responsible for this failure," Mercer said, turning his gaze slowly to Sullivan. His voice was deadly quiet, dangerously calm. "I am. I ordered this unit to hold the line when the perimeter was breached. I ordered them to treat the wounded while taking fire, and they did." Sullivan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sir, I just meant the conditions, the protocols. You see a messy tent." "Major," Mercer interrupted, stepping closer. "You see mud, you see blood, you see paperwork that isn't filed in triplicate." Mercer gestured to the room with his good hand. "I see a miracle." He pointed to the soldier in bed too, the one who had received Everly's blood. "I see a private who is alive because that lieutenant." He pointed a trembling finger at Everly, hooked her own veins to his because we were out of supply. She bled herself to keep him breathing. He turned back to Sullivan, his eyes boring into the Major's soul. "You asked about the civilian in the priority bed. That woman is the key to the entire Northern Valley campaign. Lieutenant Parker disobeyed my direct order to save her life. She made a command decision, based on medical necessity, not politics, and because she had the courage to do what was right, not what was easy. We just won this war." The silence that followed was absolute. Major Sullivan looked from the colonel to the small, trembling nurse. The realization of what he had walked into, what he had just insulted, washed over him. "Sir," Sullivan whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know." "You didn't know," Mercer repeated, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "But now you do." Mercer turned his back on the Major. He walked over to Everly. The distance was only 10 feet, but to Everly, it felt like he was crossing an ocean. She tried to straighten up, to fix her hair, to look like an officer. "Lieutenant Parker," Mercer said. Everly snapped her head up, her chin trembling. "Sir." Mercer looked at her, for the first time in 18 hours. The hard, tactical mask of the colonel slipped. Beneath it was just a man who was in pain, a man who was grateful, a man who was humbled. "In 20 years of service," Mercer said, his voice echoing off the canvas walls so that every soldier, every medic, and every pilot on the tarmac could hear. "I have seen brave men. I have seen strong men. I have seen heroes with chests full of medals. But I have never seen a soldier with more heart than you." Mercer winced as he shifted his weight, fighting the agony in his shattered shoulder. He took a breath, steeling himself. "You are relieved of duty, Lieutenant," Mercer said softly. "But before you go, slowly, painfully." Colonel Mercer raised his good hand. It wasn't a casual gesture. It wasn't a wave. He brought his hand up, fighting the stiffness in his muscles, until his fingertips touched the brim of his dusty brow. He executed a sharp, slow, perfect salute. It was the highest sign of respect a soldier could give, and the butcher of Helmand, the toughest commander in the theatre, was giving it to a nurse covered in filth. Major Sullivan stared in shock. A colonel saluting a lieutenant. It was a breach of protocol. It was unheard of. But then, movement in the corner caught his eye. "Dr. Banks." The cynical surgeon, who had almost broken under the pressure, stood up. He wiped his bloody hands on his pants, straightened his back, and saluted. The medics, Jenkins and O'Malley, bruised and battered, stood up from their crates. They snapped to attention. They saluted, and then a rustling sound from the beds. Private Leo Higgins, The boy who had lost his leg pushed himself up on his elbows. He gritted his teeth against the pain, looked at Everly with tears in his eyes, and raised a trembling hand to his forehead. Everly stood there, stunned, surrounded by a ring of respect that felt warmer than the sun. The shame Sullivan had made her feel vanished. The exhaustion momentarily receded. Tears finally spilled over, cutting clean, white tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She wasn't being court-martialed. She wasn't being reprimanded. She was being seen. She raised her own trembling hand. It felt heavy as lead, but she forced it up. She returned the salute. "Permission to sleep?" "Sir," she whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her cracked lips. Mercer lowered his hand and smiled back, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his harsh face. Permission granted. Everly. As the relief team moved in to take over silently now, with a newfound reverence, stepping carefully around the sacred ground of the trauma bay, Colonel Mercer guided Everly toward the exit. They stepped out of the tent together. The sun was just beginning to crest over the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The sky was a bruising purple, bleeding into a brilliant, hopeful gold. The light hit Everly's face, causing her to squint. It was the start of a new day, a day she had fought 18 hours to see. "The war is still here," Mercer said, looking at the sunrise, his voice rough with fatigue. "But we won the night. The woman Everly saved, Farah, did more than survive. She thrived. The ledger sewn into the lining of her vest contained the coordinates of 12 major insurgent safe houses and the financial routing numbers for their funding. Within a week, based on that intel, the valley was secured without a single additional American casualty. Lieutenant Everly Parker slept for 26 hours straight. When she finally woke up in her bunk, confused and disoriented, there was no fanfare, just a folded recommendation for the silver star on her pillow. It is one of the rarest decorations for a medical officer to receive, reserved for gallantry in action. She never saw Colonel Jack Mercer again. He was medevaced to Germany for surgery that afternoon and eventually retired to a quiet life in Montana. But 4 years later, a package arrived at Everly's home in Ohio. Inside was a small, framed photograph of a battered tent in a nameless valley, taken just as the sun was coming up. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The note read simply, "Biology outranks ideology. You were right. Jack." Everly placed the photo on her mantel, right next to her nursing pin. She never told anyone the full, detailed story of the longest night. She never bragged about the salute. But every time she saw a sunrise, she remembered the weight of the ambu bag, the metallic smell of the dust, and the deep, resonant voice of the colonel telling her that she had done enough. They say that in war, there are no winners, only survivors. But on that night, in a dusty tent in the middle of nowhere, humanity won. Lieutenant Parker proved that a soldier's weapon isn't always a gun sometimes. It's a needle, a steady hand, and an unbreakable will. She risked her career to save a stranger and ended up saving the mission. If this story moved you, if you believe that the heroes behind the scenes deserve to be celebrated, please hit that like button. It helps us share these untold stories with the world. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a true story of courage. What would you have done in her shoes? Would you have followed orders or followed your gut? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.